The Wild West has always been painted as a land of freedom, wide open skies, rugged cowboys, and the thrill of the unknown. What if you actually had to live there for just one day? What happens when the bullets stop flying and the real danger begins? One wrong step, one unlucky break, and you'd be just another unmarked grave in the dust. So before you saddle up and ride off into the sunset, let's take a closer look at why the Wild West was less a dream, more of a death sentence.
Appears to do, yes.
You see, the actual Wild West was nothing like the Westerns. Life back then was hard, brutally hard. There were no hospitals on every corner, no clean water, definitely no one coming to rescue you if things went south. If you were somehow dropped into the 1880s American frontier, there's a good chance you wouldn't make it past sunset. And no, it wouldn't be because of a gunfight with outlaws. Now, let's talk about the real killer out there, disease. You might expect to hear about shootouts and saloon brawls, but those weren't what took the most lives. The silent enemy was microscopic. Bacteria and viruses thrived in the filthy conditions of the frontier. There was little understanding of hygiene, and water sources were often contaminated. Sanitation was practically non-existent. Doctors were scarce and barely trained, and antibiotics didn't exist. If you caught something serious, your fate was pretty much sealed. But imagine traveling in a wagon train, sharing food and water with strangers, and suddenly seeing people drop dead around you with no warning. One sip from the wrong barrel could take down an entire group. It's the kind of horror Hollywood rarely shows. One of the most feared diseases at the time was cholera. This wasn't some slow-acting illness. It hit like a train. Within hours, people would be violently vomiting and experiencing non-stop diarrhea, losing so much fluid that their bodies started to shrivel. Hands and feet would wrinkle up, their skin would turn cold and clammy, and their eyes would sink deep into their skulls. It looked like death was pulling them down before it even fully arrived. And back then, no one knew bacteria even existed, let alone how to fight it. So people kept drinking the same dirty water that made them sick, only spreading it more. It was a vicious cycle. People could die within a day of their symptoms. During the third cholera pandemic from 1846 to 1860, tens of thousands of pioneers fell victim, especially those making their way along the California, Oregon, and Mormon trails. Some estimates say that between 6,000 and 12,000 people died just on these routes. And cholera wasn't the only nightmare. Dysentery was just as cruel, spread through the same filthy water and poor sanitation. Imagine constant, bloody diarrhea, intense stomach pain, and a fever that wouldn't quit. With no real medicine and no one talking about hydration or electrolytes, dysentery especially took out the most vulnerable young kids, and the elderly stood little chance. If these were not enough, they had another one, diphtheria, which frontier folks dreaded more than most. It was often called the child killer, and with good reason. This bacterial infection would coat the throat with thick gray or white patches, making it nearly impossible to breathe. It spread easily, especially in tight, overcrowded homes, and with no antibiotics, even a mild case could turn deadly fast. The mortality rate hovered around 5 to 10%, but in some outbreaks, it was much higher. So cholera and other deadly diseases wiped out thousands on the frontier. Would you believe me if I told you that there's something even scarier? Beyond the big killers, people also had to deal with a strange group of illnesses that doctors couldn't even properly diagnose. They called it mountain fever, a vague term for anything they didn't fully understand. It usually referred to things like Colorado tick fever, typhoid fever, or scarlet fever, all of which came on fast, hit hard, and were nearly impossible to treat with the limited knowledge of the time. There were no labs, no tests, and definitely no vaccines. You might feel fine in the morning, then be bedridden by evening, sweating, shivering under a dirty blanket in some wooden shack. If you were lucky, you survived. If not, you were buried by sundown. And if disease didn't get you, an injury just might. Let's say you're living out on the frontier, chopping wood, cooking over open flames, riding horses, and handling tools all day. Sounds like a tough but manageable life, right? Well, now imagine doing all of that without getting any real medical help. No clinics, no ambulances, no antibiotics. You get hurt, you're on your own, or at best, at the mercy of a town doctor with rusty tools and zero painkillers. Medical care in the Wild West was terrifying. Let's be honest, what passed for treatment back then sounds more like torture now. If you got sick or hurt, the local doctor, if there was one, might try bloodletting, burning your skin with blisters, or giving you high doses of toxic minerals like mercury. Yes, mercury. They didn't understand germs, and antibiotics didn't exist yet. So whatever made you sick, they either didn't know how to cure it, or they made it worse. Even a small cut or splinter could turn deadly. There's a famous case of Colonel James Smith, an explorer who accidentally stepped on a sharp stick that pierced his foot. Sounds minor, right? But without antibiotics, he was crippled for nearly 2 weeks. In the Wild West, that meant you couldn't ride, walk, or defend yourself. You were helpless, and being helpless out there was almost the same as being dead. Something as simple as a broken bone could change your life forever. Without proper setting or splints, the bone might heal crooked, making it painful or even impossible to walk or lift things properly. That's not just uncomfortable. It could mean the end of your ability to work, travel, or defend yourself. Then there were burns, which were way more common than you might think. People cooked over fires, smelted metal, lit lanterns, and heated tools. One small accident, you're looking at a serious burn. And without clean bandages or antiseptics, that burn could become infected fast, leading to fever, pus, and possibly death. But here's the thing, even a toothache could be a death sentence. If an infection spread from your gums into your bloodstream, it could lead to sepsis, a full-body infection that kills quickly, painfully, all from a bad tooth. No root canals, no antibiotics, just pain and risk. But there was one group who faced even greater danger than anyone else out there. Can you guess who? While frontier life was harsh for everyone, it was especially deadly for women. Nothing made that more terrifyingly clear than the reality of childbirth. While today we think of giving birth as a challenging but mostly safe experience, back then it was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do. In the Western territories, the numbers were terrifying. Maternal mortality rates were 3 times higher than in places like New England, and more than 50 times higher than what we see today. To put that into perspective, one of the few organizations providing skilled care, the Frontier Nursing Service in Kentucky, had a maternal death rate of 0.68 per 1,000 births during the 1920s and 30s. Meanwhile, the national average was between 5.6 and 6.8. In areas without care, it was often worse. Why? Because most frontier women gave birth in crude, dangerous conditions, inside covered wagons, remote log cabins, or under open skies. There were no hospitals, and trained midwives or doctors were few and far between. Sanitation was non-existent. If a woman developed an infection after giving birth, and many did, there were no antibiotics, no sterile tools, and often no one with medical knowledge to help. Many women knew, deep down, that they might not survive labor, and if they did, the baby might not. To make matters worse, contraception was practically unheard of, and women often went through pregnancy after pregnancy, year after year. That meant more risk, more complications, more miscarriages and stillbirths, and little chance to fully recover. Then came the emotional toll. Back east, women had support systems, mothers, sisters, experienced neighbors who could help during pregnancy and after. On the frontier, many were isolated, giving birth alone or with only a frightened husband by their side. Even after surviving childbirth, they were often back on their feet in a day or two, gathering water, tending fires, or chasing after older children. Rest and recovery? Forget it. Now add violence to the mix. Sure, disease was the biggest killer, but violence wasn't far behind. The Wild West earned its reputation for being dangerously lawless. If you lived in places like Dodge City during the 1870s and 1880s, you had a 1 in 61 chance of getting murdered. That's terrifying. In San Francisco, between 1850 and 1865, the odds were 1 in 203. Still insanely high. Well, let's bust another myth. Those old school duels in cowboy movies, the kind where 2 men calmly face off in the middle of the street, waiting for the clock to strike high noon. Yeah, that's pure Hollywood. In reality, gunfights in the Wild West were messy, fast, and terrifying. No rules, no honor, just raw survival instincts. Historians agree that most shootouts were ambushes or split-second reactions, not drawn-out duels. If someone had a beef with you, they weren't going to wait for a countdown. They'd shoot you in the back, from across the room, or through a window if that's what it took. Winning meant staying alive, and nobody played fair. The gunslingers weren't your only problem. The Wild West was crawling with outlaws and criminal gangs who made a living by robbing trains, stagecoaches, and banks. They weren't charming anti-heroes either. These guys didn't hesitate to kill you if you got in their way. Horse thieves and cattle rustlers were also everywhere. Stealing someone's horse was practically a death sentence for the victim. No horse meant no travel, no escape, no chance. And the scariest part, there was barely any law enforcement. The frontier was often just too big and too wild to police properly. In places like Wyoming Territory in 1872, with only 9,000 people, there were 153 reported crimes, including 4 murders. It might not sound like much, but such a tiny population was an explosion of violence. Since the law couldn't always help, people just took justice into their own hands. Vigilante groups sprang up in towns and dishing out their own brand of punishment. That came with its own problems. Innocent people were sometimes targeted, and mobs didn't exactly follow due process. But for settlers moving westward, one of the biggest and most terrifying dangers came from something rooted deep in history: the conflict between Native American tribes and American settlers. As more settlers pushed into native lands, especially after the Civil War, tensions exploded into full-scale violence. These weren't just occasional fights. They were part of the larger American Indian Wars, a centuries-long struggle that turned vast stretches of the western frontier into a battlefield. The most intense period came in the late 1800s, when tribes like the Sioux in the north and the Apaches in the southwest fought back fiercely. These tribes had lived on the land for generations, and they weren't about to give it up without resistance. Powerful leaders like Crazy Horse and Red Cloud led their people in defending their territory. To the settlers, these attacks came suddenly, brutally. Wagon trains ambushed, isolated cabins raided, and travelers attacked in contested zones. It wasn't one-sided. The violence was horrifying on both ends. Events like the Sand Creek Massacre, where U.S. troops killed women and children in a Cheyenne village, showed that settlers and soldiers could be just as ruthless. The entire situation was steeped in fear, anger, and revenge, fueling a vicious cycle. For families trying to start a new life, this meant living with constant fear. Imagine building a home from scratch, going to sleep each night wondering if a war party might appear at your door. Towns were small, often far apart, and there was rarely anyone nearby to help if things went wrong. No phones, no police stations, just you, your family, and whatever weapons you had. But let's say you somehow managed to dodge the bullets, avoid disease, and keep out of trouble in the lawless towns of the Wild West. You'll still be staring down one brutal opponent, Mother Nature. And unlike outlaws, you couldn't outshoot a storm or argue with the cold. The environment itself was a daily fight for survival. The frontier was a place where the weather could erase entire communities overnight. Take the infamous winter of 1886 and 87. It was so cold that in Fargo, temperatures dropped to a bone-shattering minus 48 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed below zero for months. Cattle froze where they stood. Snow piled as high as a man, and ranchers watched helplessly as 60 to 70% of their herds died. Without livestock, family lost not just food, but also income, transportation, and survival itself. And if the cold didn't get you, fire just might. Prairie fires were nightmare fuel. They could move faster than a galloping horse, with flames leaping higher than rooftops. There were no fire departments out there, just shovels, plows, and desperation. Settlers would dig fire breaks in the dirt around their homes, praying it would stop the wall of flame barreling toward them. Sometimes it worked. Often, it didn't. Entire farms turned to ash in minutes, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth. Then came the storms, dust storms, blizzards, floods, and tornadoes. During heavy rains, the sod houses many settlers lived in, made from dirt and grass, could literally melt away, collapsing in on their terrified occupants. And in the winter, blizzards could trap families for days, cutting them off from food, warmth, or rescue. Summers in places like Arizona and Texas could hit unbearable temperatures, leaving people scorched and dehydrated within hours. Shade was a luxury, water, sometimes a full day's ride away. Then came winter, freezing winds, snowstorms, and blizzards that could trap entire families indoors with little food or warmth. With no central heating, insulated houses, or weather forecasts. People had to rely on instinct and sheer luck to survive. But did you know there was another silent killer lurking on the frontier? One that didn't carry a gun or bare its teeth. Exposure. Even in mild weather, being wet and cold could spiral into hypothermia, especially when shelter was scarce. Early explorer Nicholas Creswell wrote about being caught in days-long rainstorms, crouched under logs, soaked to the bone. Colonel James Smith once survived a brutal storm only by cramming his team under an overturned canoe. Hardly a cozy situation. These weren't rare events. For many, this was just another day on the trail. Then there were tornadoes, monsters that gave no warning. In an age before sirens, radar, or storm tracking, people had no clue a tornado was even forming until it was nearly on top of them. Take the 1889 New Richmond tornado, a massive, deadly storm that hit without warning, wiping out dozens of lives in minutes. Witnesses described tornadoes up to a mile wide, tossing debris, timbers, and even parts of houses like paper. But let's move on. Imagine this. You packed up everything, food, clothes, tools, and you're heading west, hoping to build a new life. Then you hit a river. Sounds simple, right? Just cross it. But back in the 1800s, rivers were deadly obstacles. Floods and river crossings were some of the most dangerous parts of frontier travel. One wrong step, and your wagon could tip, your boat could sink, and everything you owned, gone in seconds. In fact, settler Daniel Trebu once wrote in his journal about how his family's keelboat struck a hidden rock while crossing a river. It started sinking instantly. They were lucky to escape with their lives, but they lost almost everything they had. This wasn't rare. Drowning during river crossings was a common cause of death on the frontier. There were no bridges, no rescue teams, just swift currents and blind luck. Now imagine the flip side, drought. If floods were bad, not finding water at all was worse. In dry regions like Texas and New Mexico, days could pass without spotting a stream or spring. No water meant your livestock died, your food ran out, and your body began to shut down. In some cases, people didn't even make it through a single afternoon in the desert before collapsing from dehydration. Finding water wasn't just important, it was a matter of life or death, and unless you had local knowledge, you could easily wander straight into disaster. But nature had another card to play: wild animals. Think buffalo were slow, peaceful giants? Think again. These 2,000-pound beasts roamed in herds of thousands. Nicholas Creswell told of a night when a massive buffalo herd charged through his camp, destroying one of their canoes like it was made of twigs. These animals were tough. He once shot a swimming buffalo multiple times and still watched it crawl ashore and run off like nothing happened. But some of the most lethal threats were walking or slithering, hiding in the shadows, or even standing right beside you. Let's start with the wild animals. Mountain lions and cougars silently roamed the frontier, especially in the hills and forests. These big cats were stealth experts. You wouldn't hear them coming, just a sudden pounce, claws like knives, and jaws powerful enough to crush bone. Then there were bears, black and grisly. Surprise a mother bear near her cubs. That's the kind of mistake you only make once. A bear could rip through a log cabin wall, and no musket was going to stop it in time if it caught you off guard. But it wasn't just large predators. The West was crawling with rattlesnakes, especially in the dry, rocky regions. With at least 5 different species scattered across the Western territories, these silent killers were nearly invisible in their natural surroundings. Most victims never saw them until it was too late. A single bite could cause agonizing pain, muscle breakdown, and even death, especially since antivenom and proper medical care were practically non-existent out there. Then came the scorpions, particularly the bark scorpion, which packed a sting that caused unbearable pain, numbness, and even breathing problems. For young children, the elderly, or anyone already sick, that sting could be fatal. These guys were stealthy, hiding under rocks, inside shoes, or between bedding, waiting for the next unlucky hand or foot. And believe it or not, even domesticated animals were deadly. Horses, essential for getting anywhere on the frontier, were strong, fast, and unpredictable. A simple misstep could lead to a broken rib or a crushed skull. One of the West's most skilled horsemen, Bill Pickett, was killed in 1932 when a horse kicked and trampled him. If he wasn't safe, imagine your odds as a regular person with barely any experience. Now throw in poor sanitation and it's a disaster waiting to happen. Rivers and wells were used for everything: drinking, washing, and even dumping waste. So guess what people were unknowingly drinking? That filthy water often carried diseases like cholera and dysentery, which could sweep through a town or a wagon train in days. Wait till you hear about hygiene. Keeping yourself clean wasn't just hard, it was almost impossible. The real danger, it wasn't just about being smelly or dusty. Poor hygiene and sanitation were literally killing people. Let's start with water. In mining towns, the water wasn't just dirty, it was poisoned. Chemicals like mercury and cyanide used to extract gold and silver would run off into nearby streams and wells. Settlers didn't understand how dangerous this was. Most people just drank whatever water was available. Boiling could help, but firewood was limited, and fuel was too valuable to waste on something like clean drinking water, so people kept drinking and getting sick. Then came the bathrooms, or rather the lack of them. The standard outhouse was just a wooden shack built over a deep hole. No plumbing, no ventilation, just waste sitting in a pit. These became breeding grounds for flies, mosquitoes, and disease, especially in hot weather. And if the waste leaked into nearby water sources, which it often did, the contamination spread even faster. Toilet paper? Forget it. People used whatever they could find. Leaves, grass, corn cobs. Unsurprisingly, this didn't help the spread of infection or the discomfort. It was harsh, unsanitary, and sometimes led to cuts or irritation that could get infected too. Bathing was a luxury, not a routine. With limited access to clean water and soap being expensive, most people only bathed once a month or less. And they weren't alone. Entire towns might go weeks without anyone taking a proper bath. Dust, sweat, and grime all built up. Parasites like lice and fleas were everywhere, and disease followed close behind. Laundry and dishes, often done in the same water people drank from, especially at camps or shared living quarters. Bathhouses were rare, crowded, and not very clean, so even the places meant to improve hygiene could end up spreading more illness. What about the jobs that kept the frontier running? When we picture the Wild West, we often imagine wide open plains and adventurous cowboys, but a few of us realize just how deadly their everyday jobs really were. Just surviving the workday was an achievement in of itself. Sure, riding through open country and herding cattle sounds kind of romantic, but the reality was insanely dangerous. Cowboys were constantly on edge during cattle drives, especially with longhorns. These massive animals could panic at the drop of a hat. Lightning, loud noise, or even a cough could set off a stampede. Now imagine being surrounded by thousands of animals, all charging full speed, points pointed forward. If your feller got caught in the chaos, that was it. You were done for. And the weather didn't help either. Cowboys often worked under open skies, and during storms they were walking lightning rods. Their metal gear, spurs, buckles, rifles only increased the risk. No trees, no shelter, just hope and prayer. Then there were the river crossings. Cowboys had to guide entire herds across deep, fast-flowing rivers. A wrong move and they could be swept away and drowned, along with their horses and cattle. Next up, miners. Those folks worked underground, sometimes for 12 hours a day, swinging pickaxes in cramped, dark tunnels. Cave-ins were common, and deadly gas buildups like methane or hydrogen sulfide could knock you unconscious or kill you before you even realized what was happening. An explosion or tunnel collapse could bury dozens of workers alive. Loggers weren't any safer either. Chopping down massive trees by hand without modern safety gear meant that even one miscalculation could end in tragedy. Falling trees, faulty tools, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time meant serious injury, or worse. Even farming, which sounds peaceful, was a battle. Early farm equipment was crude and dangerous, and in blistering heat, sudden cold snaps or animal attacks, and the job could easily turn deadly. And in the Wild West, staying fed and hydrated wasn't something you could take for granted. It was a daily battle for survival. Food and water weren't just limited, they were often dangerous. Most people living on the frontier didn't have stocked shelves or general stores nearby. They had to hunt, fish, forage, or grow their own food. When that failed, things got desperate, especially in winter. During the colder months, hunting became nearly impossible. Edible plants disappeared, and storage supplies ran low. If you didn't have a full cellar or know how to track animals in the snow, starvation was a real possibility. And even when meat was available, it didn't mean it was safe. There were no refrigerators or ice boxes. Meat could spoil within hours in the summer heat. People still ate it out of sheer hunger. That meant food poisoning, nausea, vomiting, high fevers, and in many cases, death. If something didn't quite smell right, people often took the risk anyway, because the alternative was starving. Water wasn't much better. Clean drinking water was hard to come by, especially in dry regions. People relied on streams, rivers, or shallow wells, which were often contaminated by animal waste, human waste, or chemical runoff from mining. Boiling helped, but firewood was scarce, and boiling wasn't always an option on the go. Faced with dehydration, most people had to take their chances with whatever water they could find, and often meant ingesting dangerous bacteria that could cause diseases. Some settlers had the knowledge to preserve the food with salt or smoke and to spot clean water sources, but many were new to the frontier life and paid the price for inexperience. Another threat that often gets overlooked is the emotional and psychological toll of frontier life. Surviving was about battling constant fear, stress, and loneliness that wore people down from the inside. First, imagine being hundreds of miles from the nearest neighbor. No phones, no radios, just silence. If something went wrong, a loved one got sick, a storm destroyed your shelter, or bandits showed up, you were completely on your own. That kind of isolation wasn't just inconvenient, it was terrifying. It took a huge toll on people's mental health. Then there was the constant fear of violence, whether it was attacks from outlaws, hostile encounters, or wild animals. You never knew when something terrible might happen. This meant people lived in a state of constant anxiety, always alert, often staying up through the night to keep watch. It led to chronic stress, sleep deprivation, and eventually poor decision-making. Over time, it could weaken the immune system, cause emotional numbness, and leave people mentally exhausted. And let's not forget the trauma. People on the frontier were regularly exposed to death and suffering from disease, accidents, or violence. Children saw their parents die. Friends buried friends. In today's terms, many likely suffered from PTSD, though no one had the language or support systems to understand it. They pushed on or gave up entirely. What really made things worse? Well, it was the lies people believed. Medicine on the frontier was a mix of guesswork and superstition. People swallowed turpentine like it was a miracle drug, even though it caused kidney failure and internal bleeding. Whiskey was used as a cure for almost everything, which led to alcohol addiction and neglected injuries. Most folks couldn't even read, so even if real information was out there, it didn't matter. Education was seen by some as useless or even sinful. Preachers sometimes bragged about being illiterate. That left people vulnerable to deadly myths, dangerous folk remedies, and decisions based on pure guesswork. On top of all that, there was economic desperation. Life was incredibly expensive in both effort and resources. Many people were so poor they couldn't afford warm clothes, solid shelter, or enough food. The kind of poverty drove people to take huge risks, crossing dangerous rivers, working unsafe jobs, hunting in predator territory just to stay alive. And those risks often turned fatal. Debt could literally kill you. There were no banks offering leniency, no credit counseling, and definitely no government safety nets. If you owed money and you couldn't pay up, you might be driven out of town, left to survive in the wilderness with barely any food or supplies. No shelter, no roads, no help. In that world, being alone meant being at risk of starving, freezing, or worse. Jobs weren't a guarantee either. There were no steady careers on the frontier, just whatever you could find. When frontier towns went bust, they went bust fast. Mining towns especially were notorious for this. One day they were booming, overflowing with gold dust and people. The next, the mines dried up and everyone vanished, leaving behind ghost towns. Those who stayed behind, stranded, broke, and often without a way to escape. Don't even get started on infrastructure or lack of it. Roads were often just bumpy dirt paths through wild terrain. Traveling was slow and dangerous. Wagons broke down, rivers flooded, and one wrong turn could leave you lost for days. There were no phone lines, no mail trucks buzzing around. Communication took weeks, and if you were in trouble, you might not live long enough for help to arrive. Supplies were fragile too. A bad storm, a bandit attack, or even a delay in the trade route could mean no food, no medicine, and no winter clothing. And if someone got sick or injured, there usually wasn't a doctor around, or at least not a good one. And in the Wild West, not even death came with dignity. Out there, where life was already a daily fight for survival, the idea of a peaceful funeral with proper rites and mourning was often an impossible luxury. People didn't die surrounded by loved ones in warm homes. They died alone in wagons, out on the trail, or in remote cabins miles from any town. And when someone did pass away, burying them was its own nightmare. Families had to dig graves themselves, usually in harsh conditions, hard, dry soil in the summer or frozen earth in the winter. using nothing more than shovels or makeshift tools. Many were forced to bury their loved ones in shallow graves simply because they couldn't dig deep enough. But shallow graves came with horrifying risks. Wild animals, wolves, coyotes, even bears could dig up bodies, leaving families traumatized all over again. Worse, those same graves could contaminate nearby water sources, spreading disease to the living. In the middle of a harsh winter or during a cholera outbreak, families might have to bury multiple relatives in just a few days with no time to grieve properly. Forget coffins. Wood was too expensive or unavailable. Most people were buried wrapped in whatever they had on hand, a worn-out blanket, a tarp, or old canvas. There were rarely ministers or priests around, so funerals were rushed, silent affairs with no eulogies, no hymns, and no traditions to bring comfort. To make it worse, records weren't kept, and markers were often just wooden crosses that rotted away or blew over with time. As a result, entire landscapes became dotted with unmarked graves, each one holding someone's story, lost to the wind and dust. So when you look at the big picture, it's clear. The Wild West wasn't a land of freedom and opportunity. It was a gauntlet of survival between disease, violence, wild animals, mental strain, poverty, and failing infrastructure. Every day was a gamble. One wrong move, one bad break, and your life could unravel in hours. So it's safe to say that it truly was one of the most dangerous places in human history. Now, could you have survived even a single day of the Wild West? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that go beyond the myths. Now, here to watch our deep dive on how pioneers of the Old West kept food fresh, or follow YouTube's recommendation based on what it thinks you'll love next. The choice is yours.